Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to USTA Florida's Here to Serve podcast. My name is Laura Bowen. I'm the Executive Director here at USTA Florida, and today's episode, we're going to give you a very early sneak peek at the results of our economic impact study on tennis in the state of Florida. And I have two great guests to walk us through this study, how we conducted the research, the methodology used, and what the report tells us about tennis and why it is the best investment that we can make. My first guest on today's podcast is somebody who will be familiar to you. Brad West has been with our organization for quite some time. He is actually our CRM and data analytics project manager. He oversees our operational efficiency projects, and he's kind of a master of collecting all the information and data that we house at USTA Florida. Brad and I did a podcast earlier in the year where we talked about the research that we were doing this year to try to get better business insights that we could use in our business to really grow the game. Brad's joining us today to walk through this new economic impact study, what we learned by going through the research process, and some of the maybe surprises and not so big surprises from the report. Joining Brad is Greg Pepitone. Greg is the Associate Director of Tourism Economics. And Tourism Economics is the company that we worked with to produce the report. Greg actually has 15 years of experience providing strategic advisory services to clients in the sports, convention, and tourism industries. He focuses in the areas of economic and fiscal impact assessment, market viability and strategy, business planning and analysis, and facility and other capital project planning. Greg has been a phenomenal partner to us. He works with clients in both the public and private sector, and sports and recreation are one of the big areas for him. And he happens to be based here in Florida in Tampa. So very excited to have this conversation with Greg and Brad and give you guys a preview of what this study is going to show when we formally release it in December. I hope you take the time to listen, that you enjoy the insights from this report and from Greg and Brad. And don't forget to drop your comments or questions on our social media channels. We love to hear from you. Brad, Greg, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of the podcast. I've been waiting to do this for quite some time and really excited that we're super close to announcing our new economic impact report. So, Greg, I want to start with you today. Can you tell us a little bit about your company and the types of research that you do?
Of course. Happy to kick it off, Laura, and thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm with Tourism Economics, and we are a subsidiary of Oxford Economics, which is a global economic consultancy firm with about 700 economists located throughout the world. Tourism Economics is about 70 economists and data scientists located predominantly in the US, Europe, and Asia. And we work with over 300 destinations and affiliated companies on various analyses related to visitation and the visitor economy. I personally I'm based in Tampa.
Florida.
And so I'm part of our economic development team, and I focus a lot of my time on the sports, the event, and the attraction space. And so I work nationwide and even internationally, but I do a lot here in Florida as well. And so some of the recent projects I've worked on that are publicly known, we work for the Florida Sports Foundation on an impact study for them related to sports in Florida. Recently completed one for Disney World. And then we also assisted the Jaguars with their new Stadium of the Future.
Awesome. Well, you're in the right state for that kind of research, because certainly Florida is the sports mecca. And we actually found you through the Florida Sports Foundation. So we're very grateful that you had a relationship with them and you happen to be in Tampa, which is, good for us. It's super close.
Yeah.
Brad, we did have a previous podcast where we chatted a little bit about this research and the type of work that we're doing now. Why is it important for us to engage in this type of report beyond just looking at our own data and our own numbers that we collect?
Yeah, I think that's the important word in there is the beyond piece. This really goes beyond us having the information and insights for ourselves to better understand our business and make internal strategic decisions. This report really allows us to take that information and translate it into how tennis in Florida is driving economic impact, benefiting local communities and the state as a whole. It also, this type of report allows us to provide another set of tools for our staff, volunteers, local advocates, to have more meaningful conversations as to the benefits of investing in court infrastructure and or bringing certain tennis events into communities.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question about that. Can you talk a little bit about the information we had to pull together for this report and kind of what you learned as you were going through that process? Because I think we had some really interesting key learnings as we were starting to pull together the information.
Yeah, Greg and his team really put us to work here, and came up with some really good and presented us with some really good challenges. I think one of the we gathered a lot of information. We gathered detailed information about the over 1,500 adult, junior, and wheelchair tournaments that took place here in Florida every year. And last year, it's included things like participation, not only by level, but also event types, such as singles, doubles, etc., age divisions, number of courts at the facilities where the tournaments took place. And we also gathered similar detailed information on the over 20 adult league sectionals and junior tournament sectionals that take place every year. And in all of the cases, we took into account the percentage of participants who live more than 50 miles from the event and would typically travel and stay and spend in local communities. And that included an average number of people who are considered, quote, spectators, such as family and friends that attend these events, but also may be traveling with participants for these events. The biggest takeaways for me were that the information's not all in one spot oftentimes, and it's extremely important to know where to get the information from. Um, and that tourism economics does a great job of translating this information into insights that allow us to see real economic impacts by event type, by level, number of courts, etc. We can see attendee and non-local attendee sizes by event type, such as our sectional events that average over 400 attendees per event with an average of over 80% non-local. That really translates into local economic impact.
Yeah, and I thought it was a really good exercise for us to go through that reminded me of something you've said time and again, which I think is a good reminder for everyone. Sometimes you don't even know what information you should be collecting until you think about the actual insights you're trying to gather. And I think this was a good learning for that to say, work with Greg and say, this is the type of information that Greg needs. And then we went back and we started to discover that's not easy to get. And we should be collecting this in a better or a different way so that we can do a better job of this going forward. And I think you've talked about that a lot, that the business insights that you're trying to gather drive the data that you're collecting, not the other way around. And I feel like just in general, a lot of organizations are like, collect all this data, and then you're not quite sure what to do with it or that you're even getting the right thing. So I just want to give you a shout out because you had to do such a a lot of work basically to go and track down information that was in all different places. And now we have a much better understanding of what we should be collecting on a more regular basis. So thank you, Brad, for doing that. And thank you, Greg, for kind of prompting us to kind of look for things in a different way. So that is a good transition to my next question for you, Greg, which is, can you share a little bit of your insights on the methodology that you apply to preparing this kind of report? And how do the organizations that you typically work with use these reports?
Now that's a great question. And so I'll talk a little bit about the methodology first. And so we start by calculating what you call the direct spending. And this this really is the spending that's being generated within the local economies based on people attending that tournament. And that's based on the operations of the tournament, but also by those visitors that are coming from outside 50 miles and they're spending within that local community, whether that's on hotels, other short-term rentals, food and beverage, retail, recreation, and local transportation. And so we went through all that data that Brad and team provided to us to get insights on the number of tournaments, the number of participants and spectators at each one of these tournaments. And to Brad's point, most importantly, the origin of these participants, because that allows us to determine who is local, who's coming for the day, and who's spending the night. Obviously, different profiles for a day tripper versus an overnighter. And it's important to note, too, that we exclude locals. So anyone that's from within 50 miles of the playing venue, they're going to be excluded because we assume they're going to be spending money in the economy, even if they didn't participate in that tennis tournament. And so that's called the substitution effect. So once we calculate this direct spending, we then create what's called an input-output model. And we use InPlan, which is a nationally recognized tool, or input-output tool. And we created it for the state of Florida economy, given kind of the scope of this analysis. And that enables us to calculate the total economic impact. And so this includes the direct impacts that we just talked about, as well as what you might refer to or have heard of as the ripple effect or that multiplier effect. And so that includes indirect impacts, which are supply chain impacts, as well as induced impacts, which are these employment impacts. And so when you add those direct, the indirect, and induced, we get to these total economic impact. And we look at that in terms of total business sales, in terms of the number of jobs that are being supported by the spending, the wages associated with these jobs, and then the taxes that are being generated from hosting these tennis tournaments. And in terms of your second question, right, why do we get hired to do these types of reports, and how are they being used? And Brad kind of alluded to the major reason why these are being used, right, is for advocacy and for advocating on behalf of organizations or behalf of a sector within a local economy. So I would say that's the number one reason that we provide these reports. Another one could be for securing public funding. So if someone was going to go out to develop a new tennis complex and wanted to get some sort of support from the public sector, right, they could utilize our reports to get an understanding of how much of an impact is going to be generated from the capital expenditures from that project, but also the ongoing operations into the future. So kind of two different aspects there. So I would say public funding and advocacy are the two main reasons.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you touched on advocacy, because I think sometimes people don't connect those dots. And you touched on something like sales tax, and we know there are municipalities in Florida, both counties and cities, right, that have like penny or half penny taxes, and in some cases those actually go directly back into recreational spending. So the more people you can bring in to collect those tax dollars in their business spending while they're there, the more funding you have to go back into your recreation or other facilities. I know Seminole County does that. I know the city of Gainesville does that. So when we're talking to our tennis community and we're sharing with them why these events matter, right? Why having these types of events matter when they're trying to get their courts resurfaced or expanded, it's because cities are using those tax dollars in a lot of cases to feed those capital improvement projects. And then, of course, we have to be at the table to say, and this is why tennis matters and why it has a good impact on the community. But I'm glad you both touched on that, because sometimes that's not top of mind for people, of how this spending actually translates into having better amenities, better tennis centers, improvements. And we've seen this be very, very common now, where cities are putting these items on the ballot and renewing their penny or half penny sales taxes. And so this is a great advocacy tool for that.
And I think too, another key tax, right, is that lodging tax, right?
Yes, the
So
heads in beds.
these exactly, and so
hmm
lots of CVBs or sports commissions are funded by that lodging tax, and that could help to promote these venues at the local level. It could help to attract other tennis events to come and play and host events in their local communities.
So let's dig into that for a minute. That's actually my next question for you, Greg, is can you talk a little bit about the findings, right? And maybe what stood out to you in terms of those spends and impacts as you worked on the report for us. Did the findings actually match up with what you thought you were going to get?
Yeah, so going into this, I knew it was going to be a big impact. So just as a bit of background, so I moved to Florida. I moved to Sanibel in middle school, and so Southwest Florida. And so, I grew up around tennis courts. I played leisurely. My brothers played more competitively and some friends. So I was familiar with the landscape, and it was a big thing down there. And so I knew it was going to be a big impact, right? People traveling to camps, people traveling to tournaments to, you know, to play and to rank. Um, so I knew it was going to be a big impact. And so it was, as a spoiler alert,
Mhm.
the total impact was huge. It was about $146 million, which includes those direct spendings, indirect and induced impacts as well. And so I knew it was going to be a big number going into it. I would say, Brad was talking about some of those more granular analyses that we did going into it related to kind of the court, the venue sizes in terms of the different types of tournaments that are being held. And so we did a pretty granular analysis there, and it really had a strong correlation. You could see, right, on the size of the venue, on the type of the tennis tournament, in terms of the impact that's being generated, right? Longer events, more participants, more people coming from out of town. So all of these, that was a bit, eye-opening to me as part of this analysis.
Yeah, and I think those are some of the things that there's a balance, right? We hear from communities from time to time that they're like, well, we don't want our tennis center to be closed on the weekends, right, for tournaments and things, but understanding that hosting a few events a year can actually help your tax base and help make sure that your facility and your local businesses get your revenue. And I think that was a big takeaway from the report for me, is I wanted to know what that local spend looked like, because those are local business, local residents that these tournaments are supporting. So it kind of, I hope at least it assuages that us versus them, like this is our facility, we don't want outsiders coming in. And it's like, but you know, there's part of a whole picture here of supporting your local economy, your local businesses, your local hotels, your local Airbnbs, your local restaurants, shops. And we see that, here in Orlando, we saw it in Daytona Beach when we were based there, that a lot of the businesses thrive when we have participants come in. So I'm really happy that you kind of talked a little bit about that. Brad, I'm curious about your biggest takeaways from the report and how you think we can use this information to grow tennis in the future.
So there's several takeaways for me. Both of you have alluded to some of them. One is that, the concentration on the data and information that we need to focus on and to gather on a consistent basis and how to get that. But also, this report for me really shows that tennis is so much more than local recreational play, which is oftentimes how people think of it. That the sport of tennis has a great deal of benefits for not only the state but local communities as well. That we're having huge economic impacts. It's millions of dollars in tax revenues, which supports things like local infrastructure improvements, like you talked about. It's job creation across a variety of industries and impacts on personal income, and so much more. Um, for as far as the benefits are in regards to that, I think there's a ton of great benefits. I think this is a great tool that'll really, again, be there to support our staff better, our volunteers, our local community advocates to have more meaningful conversations. with state agencies and local communities to make sound investments into amenities that support local activity and drive economic impact. So when a local community is wondering if they should invest in building more tennis courts, yes, and here's why. If a state or local agency is wondering if they should invest in grant programs that support tennis in communities, yes, and here's why. I think it's a tool that can be used for those looking to open up a facility or amenities to include in local development projects, and a tool that could be used by the sports complex industry as to why tennis is a valuable sport to include in those projects and facilities. And just a ton of other things. It's just really eye-opening and really impactful, I think.
Well said, Brad. I know this report didn't include everything. We talked a little bit about that, right? We're talking about the, recreational tournaments and our sectional events. There's so much more, as you alluded to, Brad, in the tennis space. So my final question for each of you is, what do you think we could add to this research in the future to make it even more meaningful and impactful to our audiences? And so maybe, Greg, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, of course, happy to throw out some ideas there. We did dig deep in terms of kind of the analysis on the size of the venues and the tournaments themselves. I think what we could do to expand upon it is this impact assessment was for the state as a whole, right? So what is the impact aggregated across the entire state? We obviously could dig a little bit deeper there and split the state into regions or look at specific locations within the state and conduct impact studies, for each region. So what slice of that entire direct spending is attributed to, Southwest Florida or wherever you wanted to split it up.
Brad, what do you think we could add beyond what Greg said that would maybe make this research even more impactful and meaningful?
I think Greg mentioned a lot of great things, and kind of along those lines is maybe some case studies here in Florida of, economic benefits that local communities who have invested in tennis infrastructure have seen, or economic benefits that local communities have seen that have brought new tennis events to their area. Another area might be a deeper dive into court inventory, taking growth projections into account and the economic benefits of planning and investing in court inventory in local communities and throughout the state.
Yeah, I love that one. I know we've talked about that quite a bit. And what I loved about this report is it kind of gave us some sort of baseline to, if we're recommending how many courts, right? What are those thresholds of, if you build this many, you can do these things. But if you were to add and get to this many, you can do these things. What are those tipping points, right? So as these new developments are being planned, we can go in there and say, what are your goals? Are you looking for impact locally, and how much impact are you looking for? And that's going to really drive how many courts that you put there. And then that also opens up management discussion, right? To say, at what threshold does this become something that needs more regular care, feeding, and management, which we currently provide assessments on. So I love that, Brad. I think the infrastructure side, planning the courts appropriately, being part of larger multi-sports complexes is really a great thing. And I hope that we do get to do that. And then Greg, certainly, whether it's regions or particular municipalities and areas where we're seeing a lot of play pressure, right? Because of population influx. Tampa's one of those. Actually, Tampa's sort of this unique area where we have adults, youth, we have everybody, and they're all there. And so how do we do those analyses in a way that then we could sit down and say, this is why building a facility here in this area makes sense, and what the potential impact would be short-term and long-term. So I think you both provided great suggestions there. We're going to keep building on this. So Greg, we've got you on speed dial for the future.
Of course.
Hope you don't mind. But thank you both for joining me today. That's all the time we have for today's pod. And for those listening to the podcast, the full report, along with infographics and talking points and message points that you can use to drive tennis support in your area will be available on our advocacy pages later in the year. We're scheduled to release it on December 5th. So check back on December 5th and we will have the full report. But for now, feel free to use the information in this podcast and reach out to us with any questions. So thank you, Brad. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
so
you.
much. Pleasure to be here.
That's all for this episode of the Here to Serve podcast. I hope you enjoyed our guest today. For more episodes of the Here to Serve podcast, including all of our fall topics, guests, and dates, visit USTAFlorida.com/here to serve.